Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. And today I want to talk about menstruation in fiction. So, it is not a topic that comes up a lot in the fiction that I read, but there's been some recent books I've read that have tackled the topic and handled it really well, I think. And it's something I'd like to see more in fiction. So, I'm going to talk about these three recent books that I've read and how they've handled discussions of menstruation in them. And yeah, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about why it might be an important topic that more authors should take on. So, the most recent book that I've read that handles the topic of menstruation and really kind of puts it at the center of its story is Lobizona by Romina Garber. This is the Latinx inspired story. It's fantasy, young adult, and you follow a teenager who is a werewolf but is not aware of it right from the beginning. Like, she doesn't know her family history, she doesn't know her father. Immigration is a big part of that story. Our main character and her mother are immigrants from Argentina, and they're in the United States undocumented. So, menstruation, how does that come into play in Lobisona? It's a major part of it. Every month, when our main character menstruates, she needs to be put in like the equivalent of a kind of coma. It's not really a coma, but it's something like that. And she ends up having a very heavy period, and she's out while she has it. So in the story, like, she talks about pads, about having to have a thick pad, about heavy menstruation flow, about then lighter menstruation flow. There's even a reference at one point where she is out and about in town and she realizes that she hasn't changed her pad in some time. And so it's a recurring issue, and in fact it's a central part of who our character is, because every month when she menstruates, it's a connection to the werewolf side of her. And so it is central to the story. It is handled. And I like that really blew me away, because I feel like it's so rare. Even when menstruation gets mentioned in fiction, I feel like it's not central to the story in the way it was in this book. And this is the first of what's going to be a series. So I'm actually excited to see what more meaning there's going to be to the menstruation. Like, it's clearly connected to the werewolf side, and I'm interested to see how Garber is going to explore that more. Like, what exactly does that mean? Is it something that is a burden? Is it a positive? Like, what is it? Because in this first book, Garber was just setting the scene, and there's a lot of elements that are not fully explained. The meaning's not fully understood yet, and I'm really excited to see where that's going to go, and hopefully it will continue to play an important part. I figure it will, because it was such an important part of this one. But that is one book that really handles that well, I thought. The next book that I read that also engages with the topic of menstruation is Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a African futurism story. It's set in a post-apocalyptic Africa, in which we follow a girl really during her teen years, but through most of her life. We're following her, and she is the result of her mother's rape by a colonizer man. She is lighter skinned, and so her identity as the result of a rape is very obvious in a darker skinned society. She struggles a lot with that. She struggles with feelings of belonging and of making her mother proud, and also what her parentage, her biological father, what role he plays in her life. As part of the story, we're following her, as a young child, and she discusses menstruation, and she discusses the fact that she panics when she first menstruates. She knows what it is, but also it feels really wrong, and it feels weird, and like the feelings and the meaning of it is discussed, because this is like her introduction into womanhood, and she doesn't want to talk to her mother about it. She actually keeps her menstruation from her mother at first, because once menstruation occurs, it means that she can get pregnant, that sex can happen, and it has a different kind of meaning to it. This book, I should mention, comes with a lot of content warnings. There's violence, there's on the page rape, and it's a theme that continues throughout the story. There's also female genital mutilation, and so a lot of it is about how important these things are in the character's life and in the female friends she makes. So I actually think that it's a really good book. The whole story is not about menstruation, and the topic of menstruation is not as central in Who Fears Death, but it's definitely an important part of the character's early life as she's discussing it. And lastly, I think the book that made me want to talk about this topic was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. And so the premise of The Poppy War, in case you haven't heard, is this young woman in China who is trying to make it out of her village, and she decides to apply for this big exam, and she needs to get the highest mark possible because that would mean she can go to the military academy in China for free. And she can score probably high enough to be accepted into some of the other academies, but they would cost money, and she does not have the money. That's the basic premise. In The Poppy War, the first part, you see her trying to study for the exam, then you see her at the school, and then there's a brief period of war at the end. So there's several kind of big topics in this book. Where menstruation comes in is when she's at the military academy. She's one of a handful of females that have been accepted into the academy. There's more males that have been accepted into this military academy, and she's given a choice once she begins menstruating, because it affects her ability to fully participate in the military training. Essentially, it hinders her at first, and she experiences menstruation then as bad, as something that prevents her from achieving her goals. And so she tries to figure out what she can do about it. She, at this point, is not friends with a bunch of her classmates. So she kind of notices how some of her other classmates are handling it, but she can't go have conversations with it. So she decides she's just going to end it. Menstruation if it's going to hinder her ability to fully participate and achieve her goals, then out it goes. And so she takes very drastic actions to actually eliminate menstruation and eliminate her ability to reproduce. And that was really interesting, in a fantasy novel in which you follow a female character, that the author brings in menstruation. And I think what the difference here is that the author is female. The author identifies as female and knows that this topic needs to be addressed, because at the same time I was reading other fantasy novels and written by men, and the topic of menstruation never even came up. And it is possible that when you are training very heavily, right, that the physicality of that training is going to stop menstruation, but not always and not for everyone. So I always felt like in these kind of fantasy novels in which you're following a group of female characters training for war, why isn't menstruation coming up? And R.F. Kuang just highlighted that problem in other fantasy novels very much by putting it in The Poppy War. And it's not a central part of the story. It doesn't come up again. It just eliminates that whole topic of reproduction out of the story by having the main character take such drastic actions on it. Now, all right, so I actually really enjoyed all of these books. I highly recommend them for different reasons. They each come with their own kind of content warnings, because I should say The Poppy War, it's a fantastic book. I love The Poppy War, but there is genocide, violence, body harming, there's suicidal attempts. There's a lot of content warnings in that book. Uh, but what the reason why I wanted to highlight this topic is because I think it needs to be handled more. I want to see more books engage with this topic, or at least bring it up in their stories, because I think there's a need for it. Menstruation can be a big part of a person's life, especially given the state of how bad sex education is in the US, but all over the world, really. And it can be like, if you're not properly educated, it can be a really bad traumatic experience. I feel like the more you know, the less traumatic it can be. But personally, as somebody who experienced it and who had, I felt like, enough information on it, I knew it was coming. I'd had several friends that had already begun menstruating, and in fact, I think I was the last one in my group of friends to get her period. I still experienced it as the shock, and I'd like to see just a full range of experiences. I want to see people who experience it as a negative thing in fiction. I want to see people who experience it as a positive thing in fiction. I want to see transgender characters handling menstruation. I want to see a full range of the experience, and I feel like at this point in fiction, there's not enough of it out there. There is some, like, I don't have to search too terribly hard to find these books, but I think we could use more of it. So what do you think? What do you think? Do you have other books you would recommend that handle the topic of menstruation, especially if you know any like adult books on it? Because I have a feeling that the topic is easier to find in probably middle grade and young adult books. But I will take any and all recommendations in whatever genre you have them, because I'm just finding it very fascinating to see how different authors handle this topic. So that is it for me. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.